Have you ever had a game change your life? It's not sudden, at least for me that is. Just like with New Vegas, I never really had an epiphany that this game, this series had stirred up something special inside of me until it was too late. And yeah, on the surface, the Yakuza series of games comes off as just another quirky Japanese action RPG with a funny meme or two that you might have seen here and there on the internet. Occasionally, the combat might get praised or the boss intros, but I find myself gravitating towards these types of games which aren't really known for their highly engaging stories, just like Yakuza and DMC, but whose main claim to fame lies within their combat or the presentation. And sure, these games excel at these aspects, but I find a lot of people dismiss any deeper themes or plot threads, which I hope this video will convince you is a serious mistake. I first became aware of Yakuza 0 because a friend of mine was streaming it, and it looked fun enough, but I very clearly remember saying to him that although this game seemed nice, I didn't really want to get invested in the series with 8 mainline games and many more spin-offs. What persuaded me wasn't really the game itself, at least initially that is, but rather the soundtrack. I had seen a Coriolatto meme, and the music sounded pretty groovy. I decided to see the source and listen to it at the gym. After that, Rain came on autoplay, then other tracks, and, well, if something had music this good, it was worth at least a look. Half a year or so later, and I just finished Yakuza 7 by the time I'm writing this script, with over 400 hours in total spread across the main series of games. By that admission alone, I hope you'll bear with me as I lay out my deep love for the series, and why I think Yakuza 0, Kiwami 1, and 2 make up a perfect trilogy, although obviously not in a way that was ever intended, given that the first game is a prequel and the other are remakes of the first 2 games ever made. This video will be divided into 3 parts, each explaining every game's significance both to me personally and thematically, as 1/3 of what I perceive to be a cohesive whole. I'll make an effort not to mention stuff that happens in the later games than the one I'm talking about, so if you've, for example, only beaten Yakuza 0, you can fully watch that part without getting spoiled on the other games and so on. With that out of the way, let's start at the beginning, the origins of our characters, and the unintended starting point of this long journey. You know, prequels are a funny thing. A good one will recontextualize the games that come after them and give them even more depth. A bad one will fail to make any meaningful change at best and create massive plot holes at worst. In my opinion, Yakuza 0 is of the former kind, and massively so. In order not to spoil things as much as possible, or recalling the plot beat for beat, I'll talk about Yakuza 0 in the language of themes. Yakuza 0 tells the story of Kazuma Kiryu, a young man starting out his career in the Japanese mafia alongside his brother, Akira Nishikiyama, who together grew up in an orphanage ran by their adoptive father Shintaro Kazama. It is said pretty early on that the only reason the both of them even became Yakuza in the first place was to mimic and help him, the man who not only saved their lives by adopting them, but who is constantly shown respect and admiration by his colleagues. This theme is repeated several times over throughout the story, with Kiryu going so far as to risk his life trying to quit the Dojima family in order to save his reputation after being framed for murder. It is here where Kiryu first meets the 3 Dojima lieutenants, who each play a central part in the story and represent aspects of the man he will attempt to become. First off is Kuze, whose whole MO is tenacity. Early on in the first chapter, he repeatedly tries to make Kiryu spy on Kazuma now that he's in prison. After our valiant protagonist rejects his offer, he dismisses him and leaves him to die, but despite all odds, he does make it to the top of the building. There, Kuze waits for him in a stoic manner, not trembling, not in a readied stance, but calmly explaining that
下にいた役立たずどものせいで勘違いさせてまったらしいが
and they truly did. But follows next is the first of many fights where you come to learn that this old man can really pack a punch. As the first boss in the game, and chronologically the entire series, Kuze is a great foe to Kiryu, not only with his cool theme and the full back tattoo, something the video game Yakuza equivalents mostly forego in favor of cleaner, more concise imagery, but also in his demeanor, young, idealistic, and foolhardy, versus old, cynical, and battle-hardened. Although, there is one quality they both share, something that throughout his encounters with the man, Kiryu picks up on, and that is tenacity. Getting back up again, no matter how battered and bruised you are, even just to spit in the other guy's face or teach him a lesson. I mean, let's pull all of this into perspective. Daisaku Kuze is a 50-ish year old man who gets his finger cut off, survives a bicycle crash, getting hit by a car and a jaw-shattering punch, and still gets up to kick your ass. Matter of fact, if he was 20 years younger, Kiryu would have stood no chance against the beast. But just the love of the fight isn't the virtue that's going to keep you going on an empty tank. No, there's something more to it. At least in Kuze's case, it's pride. There's a great quote by him near the end of the game that illustrates this perfectly in my opinion.
それさえありゃ、男は笑いながら死ぬことだってできる。
This, I think, is the final piece of the puzzle as to what drives Kuze as a person, the source of his tenacity. It is clear that throughout every encounter, most notably the monologue in the sewer fight, that Kuze sees Kiryu as a snot-nosed brat desperately trying to butter up to Daddy Kazuma with his every move. But as the story progresses, he realizes the man he continues to fight is just as tenacious as him. Not only that, he's ready to carve out his own ideals, different from his father's, no matter how hard and painful that may be, to protect the ones he loves, even if he can't do that all the time, and to live and die by his convictions. Another great piece of evidence for this interpretation is the aforementioned black and red tattoo on Kuze's back. The menacing portrait here is Enma, the god of the underworld in Shinto Buddhist mythology, whose role it is to judge souls as they enter hell, separate the wicked from the worthy. In fact, this is even further reinforced if we take a look at Kuze's theme names. Both Pledge of Demon and Oath of Enma allude to this fact, and overall present Kuze as a walking trial for our would-be dragon to overcome. At the time of their final battle, Daisaku is ordered to bomb the Kazuma family office, something no one at the time there could stop him from doing, but instead, he waits out front, patient and understanding. He pulls up his fists to challenge Kiryu one last time, to test if his tenacity is as strong as his own. Then, once he's successfully passed it, Kiryu bows and gives respect to the man, admiring his spirit and giving him honors the likes of which only he out of the 3 lieutenants deserves. Next, we have to talk about decadence, another central theme of the game, and who better to embody it than our next Dojima lieutenant, Hiroki Awano. Right from the get-go, even from his voice alone, we can tell the contrast between Kuze's gruff demeanor and Awano's sleazy tenor. The man is dressed in bright colors, clearly enjoys the pleasures of the time, signified by the first lines that come out of his mouth in your initial introduction to him. And would rather solve his problems by sweetening the deal rather than crushing them like his brother. But let's backtrack a little bit. To fully explore the theme of decadence, we must first talk about the setting of Yakuza 0 as a whole. As you can probably tell from the clips shown so far, or if you've played the game yourself, Kamurocho in the 80s is a much more different place to that of the later games. Sure, it's obviously lacking in technology, with even mobile phones being a stunning luxury, but it's brighter, more opulent, and sleazier than ever. The streets shine with blinding neon, cash flows out of your opponents with every blow they take, and hell, you literally upgrade your abilities with money. At the same time, the Yakuza are at their height, and nothing is as sacred as a million-yen bill. Murder, torture, mutilation, everything's acceptable as long as you know your place. Which brings us to the story of Goro Majima, our secondary protagonist. On the surface, Majima's got it all. A respectable job at Sotenbori's biggest cabaret, adoration from both the townsfolk as well as the ladies, and the mettle to kick any punk's ass should they be stupid enough to pick a fight with him. But as you start to peer behind the curtain, you'll notice it couldn't be any further from the truth. In reality, he has no one's respect. He's a slave to the Omi, forced to work a joke of a post to pay back ever-increasing fees with no end in sight. He might be strong enough to run circles around random thugs, but couldn't do anything to escape the cage he's in, or his glorified babysitter. He may be sought after, but his love is forever lost. A brother that, as far as he knows, will die in prison, believing he was betrayed by the man willing to die for him. Majima's story revolves around saving a blind girl from an assassin, and all that this betrayal of the Omi entails. In its simplest form, this is an overcoming of the easy way out, a rejection of the decadence around him, regardless of how profitable it may seem, or what it may cost him. In fact, in his story, Majima does this time and time again, from refusing to kill a body double of Makoto's, even though that would allow her and Lee an easy escape, all the way to risking his life by storming Dojima HQ, which is what makes him the perfect foil to Wano, the man he has to face at the end of his journey. Here, we see a full picture of the man, as opposed to the peaks we've had throughout various moments in the story. He reveals to be a sadist. Plain and simple, it is unclear to what degree he once had honor. In fact, it's heavily implied he didn't, shooting random girls just to prove a point, beating Kiryu's brother right in front of him when he damn well knows Nishiki can't fight back. But a strange idea dawns on him while fighting the clearly smaller man, rabid with determination, mad enough to challenge the entire Dojima family, and their heaviest hitter no less. Some people may feel disappointed Kiryu isn't the one who gets to fight Awano, seeing as Majima had no prior interactions with him aside from seeing him at the rooftop where Makoto got shot. That's understandable, I suppose. But to me, the foolhardy Cyclops finally gets to him precisely because he isn't fighting for his brother or father, but just a random girl. A lonely, hurt girl, forgotten, neglected, and abused by the world. It's in this rejection of decadence that Awano recognizes his own laziness, the ease with which he accepted the cushy life, and the reason why he couldn't beat Majima. After all of that, he acknowledges the dedication of the committed, and chooses to try and live that way, even in his last few moments.
Awano!
そこにいる男は体力で一番金がかかる殺し屋だ。そいつに仕事を受けさせるルートと金があるかい。俺は誰だろうが好きにやる。
In the end, past the honor and the sleaze, we are confronted with the game's final theme, or at least my interpretation of it, and that is diligence. Yakuza 0 in a way demonstrates that people will always fight for a goal, but will often delude themselves into thinking they're fighting for something else. Kuze never really cared about the Dojima family. Hell, I don't think he even respected a Yakuza like Sohei, who would never get physical, have the tenacity to get his own hands dirty. Instead, he was loyal to the creed, the idea of what the Yakuza is supposed to be. Awano also makes a big deal out of acquiring the captain's seat from Kazuma, yet you can see he never really goes through with it, never has the dedication. Shibusawa, however, ever the pragmatist, doesn't concern himself with sounding threatening or making sure a code of conduct is being followed. Behind the scenes, through any means necessary, he claws towards that goal, his true goal, the one he is absolutely confident is his actual intention. I mentioned earlier that the lieutenants were very good characters for exploring the central themes of the game, but they're not the only ones who embody these ideas. Lee and Nishitani are very formative in Majima's journey to reject the easy path and go balls out, while Nishiki demonstrates the kind of thinking that makes killing your brother to spare him a prolonged and gruesome death seem like an honorable thing to do, even if beneath the surface that's simply running away and easier to do than taking on the much harder task of standing alone against a massive mafia organization, a lesson he later learns, which lets him stand proud beside Kiryu. But these are all characters with nuance, layers, 3 dimensions to them, while Majima's last boss is a clear, ruthless demonstration of the final theme. Lao Gui, meaning old ghost in his native Chinese, is, as Dojima himself puts it,
そこにいる男は体力で一番金がかかる殺し屋だ。
He isn't fighting for a cause, he isn't fighting with honor, and he is entirely dedicated to killing or maiming by any means necessary. Despite having to fight the closest thing to a literal monster, Majima makes it out victorious, and we cut back to our confrontation with Keiji. On the rooftop of the Shibawara Wharf stands the seemingly victorious Shibusawa. He's captured Makoto, thinned the Nikkyo Consortium, and lured in Kiryu to a one-on-one fight, because as the man explains, making captain was never his goal, surpassing Kazuma was. A Yakuza is nothing if he doesn't command respect, but fear is no substitute for admiration. Throughout this game, and even the series as a whole, we've seen hulking brutes and powerful fighters, but that isn't enough for you to cement yourself as a legend. We learn that Shibusawa's father, much like him, helped from the shadows and didn't stand out, but this very timidness allowed his boss to take credit for his work and then blame him for the failures that weren't his. It may seem like Keiji is retreading the same exact path, but it mustn't be confused. Where his father helped sheepishly from behind the curtain, Shibusawa plotted with patience and diligence. He knew just being captain to the patriarch wasn't going to be enough. That alone would put him in the same position as his father. He needed a legend, a title. Kiryu doesn't care. To him, a title is meaningless. In fact, it is repulsive if you pen your name in someone else's blood, like Shibusawa's done. But here we have a great response from Keiji, calling out the young man's naive hypocrisy. The whole reason he set upon this journey, protecting Kazuma, was not out of altruism or concern with moral good, but pure and simple debt to his foster father. As a matter of fact, Kazuma himself was dirty. The Tojo clan's best assassin was a murderer, plain and simple. He dragged innocents like Tachibana and Makoto, who could have reunited without taking part in the empty law debacle, but whose part was necessary in Dojima and his lieutenants' downfall. In many ways, most of which we'll get to in the later games, Shintaro Kazuma was a failure of a man, who, although admirably embraced honor by trying to help his children and others outside of the Yakuza, was forever stained by the black deeds he had carried out. But this isn't the time for talking. Even if he has a point, Shibusawa must pay. And as the music swells up, we finally discover what is that title that he's diligently killed for.
Ryu 背負ってんのはお前だけじゃねえんだよ。お前を殺し風間を越えてほら堂島の竜になる。俺はそんな肩書きはいらねえ。だが竜は一匹でいい。ああ、お前の言う通りだ。付き合ってやるぜ、そのくだらねえ戦いに。
The dragons clash. Shibusawa swings his fists in a deadly storm, just like Kiryu's rush style. Hurls furniture mercilessly, mirroring the beast style. Finally switches to an infernal red heat, symbolizing a ruthless, determined manner of combat, fit for a legend. But like is said in the series time and time again, there can only be one dragon. Bleeding out on the floor, Shibusawa taunts Kiryu one last time, urging him to kill him, to finally take a life, follow in his father's footsteps, and make a name for himself. Determined, diligent, and fueled by bloodlust, Kazuma complies until a certain someone stops him from connecting that final thing.
ダメだ、Kiryu! 錦、越えちゃならねえ。その一線越えちまったら戻ってこられなくなる。 こいつ殺したとこで何にもならねえだろうが。お前勝手に先は死んじゃねえよ。兄弟踏みとどまれ。いつか最後の一線を越えなきゃならねえ時が来たら、そん時は俺も一緒に越えてやる。だから錦。
This is the turning point for Kiryu, and to an extent Majima as well. The two protagonists stop just shy of committing murder, and for what I think almost everyone would agree is a just cause. However, we are reminded that you can never repay someone for killing on your behalf, a lesson taught to us even more painfully later on in the series. You can't just make it on diligence alone either. That's why Shibusawa failed and Kiryu was going to follow suit, until Nishiki stopped him. Yakuza 0 is a game about pride, a game about realizing that the easy path may look tough and that drastic decisions might seem grand, but on the surface are the coward's way out. A game about perseverance, no matter how many times you fail, and questioning without renouncing. Ultimately, Kiryu sees the error of Kazuma's ways, and although he'd still willingly give his life for the man, chooses to be better. As he puts it himself, when he finally decides to rejoin the family after all.
白も黒も気分じゃねえ。今の俺はこれがいいんだ。俺が決めた。これで始めたいんだ。
Even Majima learns to respect Sagawa, the man who's caused him nothing but trouble and hardship, for the lessons he imparted on him. He takes on the spirit of Nishitani and Lee, their diligence, their kindness, their unapologetic bravery, disguised as madness, and builds upon it.
真島五郎っち男の生き方に。
Throughout all the minigames, side activities, and wacky stories, we tend to forget that this is the heyday of the Yakuza, the mob, organized crime. But Yakuza reminds us of this in a spine-chilling contrast. Not only are the performances in Zero stellar, due to the now experienced voice actors for the main characters, but also the many real-life movie stars who play the new entries in the series. At the end, Zero has not only arguably the best combat, music, and side stories in the series, but also the simplest story about the bulk purchase of a lucrative property that weaves all of these interpersonal motivations into it. And yet, it's still not my favorite in the series, which will have to be our next entry. Friends, comrades, brothers, what does it mean to have them? Are they people we unconditionally love? Well, no, not quite. Otherwise, the expression, you don't get to pick your family, but you do your friends, wouldn't hold any truth. Then in that case, are they just people with similar interests, or ones we were paired up with due to circumstance? Colleagues, classmates, and the like? Again, I don't think so. Plenty of people have the opportunity to go their separate ways after work or school, but choose to stay together. I don't claim to have all the answers to these questions. Maybe this game can make you think about it in a new way, help you reflect on these topics we really don't give enough thought to. Yakuza Kiwami opens with a pan of the Kamurocho streets we've grown accustomed to 7 years after the events of Yakuza 0. Then a slow shot of a dark office is set upon us, a man lying in a pool of blood, Dojima, and the one standing over his dead body with the revolver in hand, Kiryu. Right from the start, we know something's wrong here. The last game ended on a note about how killing isn't something to be taken lightly, and here we are starting off our main character breaking his promise to Nishiki. We cut back a day earlier to Shinji, Kiryu's protege and a character introduced in the last game. With him is Kazuma, and the title card informs us he's now a lieutenant of the Dojima family, a position Zero's main villains once occupied, now property of our hero. He stops by a company man trying to skip town because of his piling debts, where we get our tutorial, and on the way back is stopped by a thug he easily teaches a lesson to. However, we as the audience are soon reunited with an old friend, turned nearly unrecognizable.
桐生って そういや堂島の竜桐生一馬ちゃんや。
お久しぶりです、真島の兄さん。
As Majima expertly displays his mad dog persona, Kiryu, ever the sympathetic protagonist, stops him from killing his own man, and even takes the beating once Goto turns his wrath towards him. An important thing to remind the audience here is that Kiryu's a lieutenant of the Dojima family, while Majima is Shimano's captain. Dragon or not, this Kiryu is still adhering to the same rules as when Kuze nearly killed him at the end of Zero, and is fully aware the one-eyed maniac outranks him, so he doesn't fight back. With one grisly foreshadowing, Majima warns him that one day he's going to have to compromise on his naive principles and go hard on even his own men, then leaves the scene. Finally at peace, Kiryu goes upstairs to Serena, where we see some more familiar faces.
どうなんだ桐生組の立ち上げは。
The new character introduced here is Yumi, Kiryu and Nishiki's friend from the orphanage they grew up in. Although Akira is worried about his sister's operation, she quickly cheers them both up and they have a party as Kiryu passes out from too much of a good time. In a brief flashback, we see him buying Yumi a ring for her birthday, with her name inscribed on the inside, token of his love towards her. Waking up, Kiryu urgently goes to deliver the money he collected earlier to Kazuma, now well out of prison and with gray hair. The conversation steers towards him getting his own family when...
おう、
失礼します。桐生さんにお電話が。新次さんからです。
俺だ。
新次です。レイナさんから兄貴に伝えてくれって。今さっき堂島組長がユミさんさらっていったんです。
ユミか。なんで組長に。
詳しくは分かりません。でも錦のおじけもそれ聞いて組長のところに。
錦が。で場所は。
劇場の横のビルの組長の事務所です。
分かった、すぐに行く。
おい、どうした？
堂島組長が弓を強引に連れ去ったらしいんです。それで錦が一人で弓を助けに。
まずいな。組長は気に入った女はどんな手使っても手に入れる人だ。そこに錦山が入っていったら何が起こってもおかしくね。
俺行ってきます。
よせ。
え？
ここでお前まで行ったら3人ともただじゃ済まねえぞ。ここは耐えるんだ。せめて俺が手を回すまでお前は待て。
おやっさん、弓と錦は兄弟なんです。俺の。だから今俺が行かねえと。
カズマ。
As we enter Dojima HQ, now simply a small office compared to the fortress from the previous game, we notice the surroundings. We're right here where we saw him murdered, only it wasn't Kiryu who pulled the trigger. With the ruined and powerless patriarch devolved into a hedonistic mess, riding on the coattails of the 80s. Kidnapping Yumi, he tried to force himself on her. Enraged with the man and desperately trying to protect his friend, Nishiki was the one who broke the brother's promise instead. He shot and killed his own patriarch. Both in shock and unable to speak clearly, Kiryu takes the gun. He tells Nishiki to take Yumi and run. He has a sister to look after, and she needs him free. Kiryu, on the other hand, can take the sentence and assumes the stance we first saw him in. As a sequel to Zero, this is an incredibly jarring introduction. Shinji, the kid who hated Yakuza from the bottom of his heart, is now Kiryu's direct assistant. Dojima, the main orchestrator of the previous game's plot, is unceremoniously killed, Nishiki regrettably the executioner, and our main character is off to prison for God knows how long. If we're to present the first three Yakuzas as a trilogy, each middle point is the lowest depression of the main arc, and Yakuza Kiwami is nothing short of a tragedy. Stoic as ever, Kiryu obediently spends his 10 years in jail, with no outside information rather than the fact that Yumi has gone missing. Exiting prison alone, with no one waiting for him, who does he run into other than the mad dog himself, remarking on how a decade on the slammer can really turn a man even as hardened as the dragon of Dojima soft. This won't come up again for a long time, but Goto knows what all these years spent locked away with no hope or image of the future feels like, and he's been waiting for someone who's going to be coming out a lot later than Kiryu, if ever. Although presented in an otherworldly light 17 years ago, the caring and playful part of Majima breaks through to the surface in these interactions with Kiryu, annoying him and itching for a fight even in the most inopportune moments, but with good reason, to train him for the journey he's about to undertake. If I can break the train of thought about the story for a second, I'd like to address some criticisms about the Majima Everywhere system in the game. Just like Mr. Shakedown from Zero, Majima serves as Kiwami's world boss, offering a roaming boss character who you risk running into at every corner of the city. However, unlike the 4 brutes from the last game, Majima doesn't have big sweeping attacks that deal insane amounts of damage. He only has the styles from Zero, the styles you abused firsthand. His super attacks that stunned enemies or had gigantic reach, once the player's finest tools are now your worst enemy, as you know just how devastating they truly are. Better yet, his interactions are as varied as can be, appearing in the most unexpected places and giving you the slightest hints as to his actual personality beneath the veneer of an insane knife-wielding madman. On top of that, while you have all your styles from Zero as Kiryu, you'll notice that the 4th one, Dragon, which used to be the previous game's secret unlockable, is now pretty bare bones. You don't need to fully upgrade it, but if you finish enough of Majima's encounters and the Coliseum fights, you'll be rewarded with, among many other abilities, the Tiger Drop, aka the most devastating move in the entire series. So, unlike Mr. Shakedown, there is a very worthwhile reward at the end of your strange journey. Back to the story, Kiryu is given a letter written by Kazuma, in which he is told to go to Club Stardust where some Shimano family thugs are rattling things up. Badass as ever, he hands their asses to them on a silver platter, before one of them pulls a gun. Shinji interjects. The club owner Kazuki and Shinji sit Kiryu down and begin to untangle what's happened over the last 10 years. Turns out that while Kiryu was up for a promotion of getting his own family, now that he was out of the picture, the honor fell to Nishiki. An interesting narrative point here is that since the Nishikiyama family is now a major pillar of the Tojo alongside the Kazuma and Shimano ones, Nishiki, as patriarch, is in the same position that Dojima once was. Shinji then explains that he's actually a lieutenant in the family, planted there by Kazuma after some mysterious events took place, one of which is the recent death of 3rd chairman Masaru Sera. Understandably, Kiryu is taken aback by all this and wants to speak to Kazuma, but he's off for the funeral, which means he'll have to sneak in himself. Inside, he is finally reunited with his father, if only for a brief moment, when someone shoots him in the chest with a rifle. Disturbed by the ruckus, Shimano bursts in the room, and outnumbered by the entire Tojo clan, Kiryu decides to run. This is one of my favorite long battles in the game, as the confused and distraught Kiryu fights his way through the entirety of Tojo HQ, with this piercing and melancholic guitar that underlines his fear and sadness. You even get to battle Majima as he's under orders from his own patriarch to stop you, even though he just puts on the show for the clan. Fighting past the tiger himself, who we only now for the first time see actually unleash his claws, Kiryu manages to get away, but before he escapes, he manages to look back and see his brother he hasn't seen in 10 years, and he's just standing there, smirking and turning his gaze away. From here on out, there is no need to follow the story scene for scene, and we can talk about the game's themes like we did the previous ones. There are several ways you can interpret these, especially for Kiwami, but taking the story as a whole, I believe we can illustrate two major ideas that prevail throughout the plot and characters. those being the themes of fatherhood and brotherhood. After the funeral, Kiryu is saved by Makoto Date, a former detective he was interrogated by 10 years ago. Let off from the force and in pursuit of whoever killed Chairman Sarah, he and Kiryu team up to make sense of the conspiracy behind all of these events. During this time, Kiryu also bears witness to a little girl hidden in a bar riddled with corpses. He asks for her name. She answers, Haruka. Throughout the next few chapters, Kiryu, the hardened Yakuza, just out of jail for serving a 10-year sentence for murder, helps and protects this little girl, with the only link between the two strangers being the fact that they both grew up in the same orphanage. Yumi, Nishiki, Kiryu, and Haruka, all raised in Sunflower Orphanage, all taken care of by Kazama. With every time she gets kidnapped, we see Kiryu stalwartly rushing to the rescue, each time more pissed off and protective than the last. He even tries his damnedest to hide from her the fact her mother Mizuki is dead once he and Date realize, breaking down when the truth is revealed, and showing how hard he wanted to shield her from the life he was handed, the misfortune and pain he had to go through as an orphan dragged into hell by the ruthless hand of the Yakuza. It shows just how kind of a heart he truly has, that this innocent soul, whose path in life randomly crossed with his, can touch him beneath the exterior. And not just with Haruka. Date, the detective and pretty much only ally Kiryu has, is revealed to have drifted apart from his wife and daughter in his rabid pursuit of the Seta case over the last 10 years. Noble as his motivations are though, it becomes clear that he has spiraled out of control as his daughter is driven to an aimless life that gets her turned into a victim of Kamurocho's ruthless nightlife. Although a dead man on his own, Kiryu helps the detective, parallel to his bonding with Haruka, experiencing what can happen if he isn't there for her, not only as a protector, but a father too. We even help the informant in Purgatory, the Florist of Sai, protect his son from a Yakuza clan. Although both characters are given very little detail, we know that estranged informant has never actually met his own son, and only looks after him from the shadows. Seeing yet another ruined relationship Kiryu should learn from and not repeat. And then we have Kazama, the man we only now see after getting built up in Yakuza 0. Near the end of the story, we get the chance for him to explain what he's been meaning to ever since the funeral, about Yumi's life after the incident, her amnesia, and how he hid her away from Nishiki. It's revealed that while living her sheltered life, she met Jingu, and Haruka was their child, until Jingu decided to wipe away all of his hindrances for the top of the political ladder. Shintaro Kazama isn't a bad man, but he is a bad father, orchestrating the empty lot scheme regardless of the fact it put countless civilians as well as his own 2 sons in the crosshairs, telling Kiryu not to interfere when his own adoptive daughter is kidnapped by Dojima, and most egregiously of all, remaining distant right when Kiryu and Nishiki were at their lowest points, never bothering to talk to them or offer support. With his last words, he even reveals Sunflower Orphanage's true purpose, a place for all the children of the people he assassinated to grow up in. Kazama is a deeply guilt-ridden man, trying to atone for his sins whenever he can, but still failing to stop the creeping consequences of his actions. While Kiryu solemnly states that he still loves him regardless of that, we can see this has already left an impact on the young man. Regrettably joining the Yakuza in his father's footsteps has given him the strength of a dragon, but cost him many loved ones along the way. The only thing left for Kiryu to do now is take on his father Kazama's wishes and learn from his mistakes. Not to be a better Yakuza, but to be a better man. Have you ever had a best friend? For most of you, I'd wager the answer is a yes. We all have that one buddy, that one guy or girl we feel closest to, without whom nothing is quite as fun. Someone who'll be there for your greatest losses and your biggest victories. Someone who doesn't just share your interests, but someone who understands you, nearly as well as you do yourself, sometimes even better. A person that'd die for you, if need be. A brother not by blood, but something stronger. Conviction. But no matter how strong your bond, sometimes you find yourself questioning them. They disagree with you on something. You start disliking some little thing about them. No matter. All swept under for the sake of friendship. And yet, as the years go by, maybe you drift apart, maybe not. You notice they're doing better than you at certain things. You start off feeling happy for them, for their accomplishments. But in the back of your mind, an ugly little question starts rearing its head. Why not me? You feel disgusted at even the possibility of this train of thought, so you brush it off. But as the years go by, certain things become all things. Maybe he's better with school, work, women. He's stronger, taller, more handsome. Leaves a bitter taste in your mouth, and friendship turns to living in someone's shadow, which in turn transforms into resentment. With each chapter completed in Kiwami, we get a glimpse into what happened to Nishiki while Kiryu was in prison. He starts off being awarded his own family, and him immediately stating that he's going to use it to help his brother after he gets out of prison, with an attitude that most resembles the Nishiki we remember. Kashiwagi states that since he has no one under him as a former dojo and lieutenant, he'd be receiving some of Kazuma's men, and our next scene sees him in his own office, surrounded by the new arrivals. Only they're his in name alone. Not one of them accepts to follow Nishiki, and they explicitly state the only reason they're here is out of respect for Kazuma. Angered by the blatant insubordination, Nishiki is in disbelief, but puts his feelings in check. There are things worth swallowing your pride for. We learn that his sister Yuko's condition has only gotten worse since '95, and that he desperately needs money for her transplant. As he bottles up his feelings and has no one else to turn to, he accepts Matsushide's taunts and insults, taking the responsibility and shame just to save Yuko, whatever it takes. After all the disrespect, comparisons with Kiryu and shame, he finally has enough to pay for the surgery. But as he enters the hospital, he discovers there never was going to be a transplant. The doctor was a fraud, disappearing after his gambling debts were paid, broken, abandoned by his father, his brother rotting in prison, and sister doomed. He realizes just how much he sacrificed for absolutely nothing.
クソみてえなやつにも頭下げて死ぬ気で金を用意したってのに今までの時間は一体何だったんだ。もう優子には時間がねえってのに。
And yet, the next time we see him, he hasn't turned to violence. Just the opposite. As I talked with friends and people online about the series, Nishiki stood out as a pretty disliked villain overall. People were angered by his betrayal and labeled him as weak and petty. To me though, he's the best written and most meaningful Yakuza antagonist because, well, he's me. The reason why this particular character's story shook me as much as it did was because I was jealous of my best friend. I had those dark thoughts of envy and resentment. Those times where you never saw your brother in this type of light, but the constant reminders, the abundance of accolades and coincidental comparisons which push that little you've accomplished to the wayside, leaving you in the dust, forgotten, are things I know too well. And the reason you probably don't share these feelings is precisely because they are pathetic, narcissistic, and entangled with guilt. Alone and seemingly a disappointment to everyone around him, Nishiki prepares to take his own life, to atone for his sins and weakness, to retain what little honor he has left.
Nanda, いるんじゃねえか。おう、組長さんよ。またしのぎ広げることになったからよ。金使わせてもらうぜ。おいこら、聞いてんのか。こっちがせっかく動いてやるって言ってんだぞ。てめえいい加減にしとけよ。返事もできねえのか。あのな、おめえはどこまでヘタレなんだよ。たくまだ連れのキリヌが根性あったぜ。ま、奴がやっちまったことはまずいっちゃまずいとしても、キリは
誰がヘタレだって。誰が桐生よりも根性がないんだって。 メイドの土産に教えてやる。堂島組長をやったのはこの俺だ。覚えとけ。
When a man is deemed incompetent, impotent, and devoid of any dignity, he's backed into a corner. He has no choice but to die or fight. Violence becomes the only way to prove one's strength. After all, he's gone all this way. Acting ruthless is just part of the job description. This is probably the moment most emblematic of Kiryu and Kazuma's failures. Instead of changing it, the institution all three were roped into remains a criminal and savage one, taking in the souls of noble men and spitting out husks with ruined lives. This is also why Kiryu never rejoins after the first game, only helping out people whose own stories were forcibly entangled with the Yakuza get as far away from it as possible. In a way, from this moment on, Nishiki forgoes his ambitions of honor, and is just doing his job, the only thing that hasn't betrayed him being the feeling of controlling your own destiny, the last thing he can cling on to, the only thing this world respects. After Kiryu helps the florist, he receives a call from Nishiki telling him he wants to meet up. The place? None other than their favorite spot from the past, Serena. For Kiryu, this is a chance to finally talk to his brother for the first time in 10 years, and hopes this conversation will reveal what happened that led to all this. Fashionably late, Nishikiyama arrives with his new slick-back hair and white-on-black suit. The two sit a few stools apart, signifying how distant they've now become. Nishiki gets right to the point, the 10 billion. Kiryu refuses to hand over Haruka, and the conversation gets nowhere. What matters in this scene is that it reinstates the fact that Nishiki was doing everything in his power to not stray too far from his and Kiryu's paths. What people might perceive as evil can be turned on its head if you put yourself in the man's shoes and look at things from his perspective. When he tried shooting Kiryu in Zero, it wasn't because his family ordered him to, but because he'd rather see him die a quick and painless death than be tortured and disfigured, just like Tachibana would later be. And in every logical scenario, that would be the kind thing to do, as no one could reasonably expect the 20-year-old Kazuma to take the entire Dojima family on by himself. Although he did not kill him, Nishiki had every right to take Kazuma's life, as he killed his biological mother and father. Even when he kidnapped Mizuki and tried to get her to tell him everything she knew, it was so that he could find Yumi, demonstrated by the fact he savagely kills his incompetent men who killed his friend's sister. Funnily enough, we now see his family finally start to respect him after his ruthless streak. He even says it himself when they meet. He was hoping they could still work together, torn on the inside between the path that made him finally strong and the path he knows to be good. The two men see each other amicably for the last time in their lives, and the meeting ends with Nishiki mirroring Kiryu's words from Zero.
お前とはこれまでだ。今日限り兄弟の縁を切らせてもらう。
もう今日限り兄弟じゃねえ。
At the end of the game, Kiryu is determined to take Haruka up to the Millennium Tower, a monument of pain built on top of the empty lot, one which will be the site of tragedy for years to come. There waits Yumi, with her memory finally regained, and revealed to be Haruka's actual mother. The three get a well-deserved reunion, abruptly cut short by a helicopter whirl from the outside. Jingu lands.
久しぶりじゃないか、ユミ。それにハルカ。
お前が神宮。
こうして会うのは初めてだね、桐生一馬君。
Although I skipped parts of the game's plot and haven't really talked about Jingu so far, he's not all that developed, and for good reason. He's the antithesis to the game's themes, a selfish and greedy man, devoid of any spirit of fatherhood as he tries to kill his own daughter, just so the public doesn't discover his common past, as well as betraying Sera's brotherhood for the Omi once he realized the chairman actually had convictions, unlike him. He might be one-dimensional, but that's the point. With not even a barely altruistic motive in sight, Kiryu knows he's up against true evil. In probably the hardest boss fight in the entire series. Kiryu makes his way through waves of MIA soldiers until finally reaching the Millennium Tower's helipad. There lie Jingu and two MIA colonels who just don't know when to give up. In yet another superhuman display of strength and endurance, Kiryu dodges the array of bullets and grenades thrown at him, and defeats the snickering politician once and for all. But as he enters Ares again, his true opponent shows himself. With no more distractions, Nishiki slowly walks up to our heroes and lights up a cigarette. What seems like confidence on his part is just assuredness in the knowledge that time can't go back, that the past cannot be changed, and there is only one way forward to end both their pain. Yumi tries desperately to convince her former friend that there is still hope, and we can see his expression visibly change as he starts to believe her. But as soon as she mentions Kiryu, he's reminded yet again of the pain he associates with that name. Kiryu, in turn, tells Yumi and Nishiki that he's finally come to terms with what must be done and readies himself.
逃げることはできねえ。だから決着をつけよ
なあ、決着をつけよう。俺たちの戦いに。
After the final fight, an exhausted but relieved Kiryu embraces Yumi. She unlocks the safe to the 10 million yen and gets ready to delete that money from history. But just in the nick of time, Kiryu's relentless code of not killing comes back to shoot him in the leg. It's interesting to note that Kiryu didn't develop his moral compass because of Kazuma or Kashiwagi, when he wanted to take a life and his brother stopped him right before the act. I don't know if we can honestly say he solely developed it because of Nishiki, as he kept it way past Yakuza 1, but as if to atone for that mistake and all others along that path, the Koi rises to the occasion one last time. Yakuza Kiwami has made me realize a lot of things about myself. It honestly scared me how much my thoughts and feelings paralleled Nishiki's, but the scariest part was that I didn't see a way to resolve these issues. Sure as hell didn't want to end up the same way he did, but the game didn't really offer a good example of someone moving past these feelings of envy and inferiority. I still don't know if I've got the right answer, but I think I've gotten closer to one. You see, as we've already pointed out, Nishiki did what he did out of love, but as he felt his care was unrequited, just needlessly thrown out into an empty, bottomless pit, his actions became corrupted. What started off as building a strong family so he can accept Kiryu after his release and change the Yakuza from the inside together, morphed into becoming the most powerful, so he could no longer be ridiculed or hurt. His love for Yumi became an obsession, leading him to grow cold and unresponsive to people like Reina who wanted to help him and come to view Yumi as just another trophy to claim for himself and take away from Kiryu. But in the end, just as much as Nishiki bled out all his love, I think it's important for us to be reminded that being strong, being beautiful or talented is no price at all if it's not for sharing, just as much as it's miserable being pitied or dismissed. What point is there in ruling an empty world where everyone either hates or fears you, When I talked about prequels in the last video, I wanted to mainly underline the sheer brilliance with which RGG Studios made one of the most flat and boring characters in fiction into the series' best written antagonist, with the addition of a great prequel and several scenes in the remake, which don't even retcon or contradict the original story, just deepen it. If you're worried about this being the end of the Koi legend, don't be. The series has plenty more reminders of Kiryu's brother, even after he's gone. And hey, sometimes dragons resurrect, or at the very least, their spirit lives on. For now, I want to leave you with this. In Yakuza's spin-off, Ishin, the character portrayed by Nishiki's likeness, Okada Izo, has a boss theme called For Your Sake. If you align them chronologically with Nishiki's themes from 0 and 1 in the game's release order, you get a quaint little message, which I think perfectly encapsulates Kiwami's story. For whose sake? For your sake. For Buddy.
本当ですか柏木さん。俺が自分の国を持てるなんて。俺桐生のためにも頑張ります。てめえの子分すらろくにしつけられねえグズの指が一体何の役に立つって言うんだ。ああ、
情けねえこと言うんじゃねえ。そんなんじゃてっぺん取れねえぞ。
これじゃならねえ。その一線越えちまったら戻ってこられなくなる。踏みとどまれ。覚悟しろよ。俺は一生おめえにつきまとってやる。
Illuminated by the intrusive rays of the sunrise, Kiryu stands in front of Yumi's body, the tower's floor in ruins. He gets surrounded by cops and held up by none other than Date, but without a note of anger, disgust, or even life. He simply lays it out bare. He doesn't care what's going to happen. His protege, his friend, his love, his father, and his brother are dead. The dragon sits at the top, but that's precisely where it's the loneliest. Simply put, at this point in time, Kiryu has nothing left to live for, but with a much-needed reminder, Date points to Haruka, to that abandoned and lonely child which only he can help, and which to some degree has an obligation to. With this scene, we leave Yakuza Kiwami. The fourth chairman of the Tojo clan resigns early, and leaves Kazama's ally from the Omi, Terada, as his successor. Kiryu himself admits not much thought went into this, but instinctive trust, and leaves Kamurocho to spend his time raising Haruka, away from the Yakuza. Yakuza 2 is the game that originally cemented the series as much more than just a one-trick pony with a hilarious English dub and interesting, if underdeveloped, ideas. Ironically enough, its remake is also the game I think the trilogy can narratively end on, forming a satisfying arc, but we'll get to that a bit later. For now, I wish to say that although in all honesty it's probably one of my least favorite games in the series, replaying it for this video made me see a lot of the hidden themes and messages I didn't notice the first time around. I don't think Yakuza 2 is a cynical game per se, but it's probably simultaneously the most indulgent entry in the franchise, and the one with the most poignant criticism towards it. 1 year passes as we are taken back to the streets of Kamurocho again, this time in the most high-definition version of it thanks to the Dragon Engine. It is evident that Kiryu has finally managed to escape the life of a Yakuza, this time not by being relegated to a fate in prison, but by his own volition. But even here, at the very start of the trilogy, we get hints that the Dragon of Dojima is still deeply haunted by the events of the last game. For the last 12 months, Kiryu has been taking care of Haruka, although it may be more accurate to say she's been taking care of him. They both visit the graves of Yumi, Nishiki, and Kazuma when they are greeted by Terada. The fifth chairman quickly gets to the point. The Omi Alliance, the only other Yakuza organized crime syndicate that can rival the Tojo in power, has been itching for a fight ever since the Tojo's been on its last legs. This is why Terada wants to sign a pact of peace with their chairman Jin Goda. Kiryu reasonably says he's done with all the Yakuza business before Terada gets ambushed and shot, leaving his dying wish to once more drag him into this deadly bickering. With his path chosen for him, Haruka goes back to Sunflower, while Kiryu sets off west for the heart of Omi territory, Osaka. The last time we saw this city was through the eyes of someone deeply embedded, in fact entrapped in his nightlife. But nearly 20 years later, its glitz and glamour are unknown to us. Streets have changed and the shops have moved, yet there is one place we still find familiar. Relaxing at the Grand, our dragon is interrupted by a gang of loudmouth local Yakuza. Their leader confidently pulls their leashes back, and one of his lapdogs starts buttering him up, but with one wrong word, instantly sours the mood for the whole table.
関西の竜や覚えときや。
へえ。
どないしました？あ、こいつのせいでっか。
席外せ。
自分なんか
親父さんの前で言うたらあかんことがあるやろ。
あ、いや
ええからはよ謝らんかい。
すんませんでした。
ほらみっともないで。はよ席座らんかい。山田悪い、わしと杯交わしてからなんぼや。
2年です。
そうか。
親父
でさっき言うたこと思い出したんかい。
いや
まあ飲めや。
はい、いただきます。
これで思い出したやろ。はよ言うてみいやこれ。
関西の竜。関西の竜って言ったんだ。
As if looking for a fight, or having a straight-up death wish, Kiryu rises to the provocation, and after a short-lived fight against the lackeys, the blonde-haired boss seems to have taken a liking to him. He offers the ex-chairman a drink, which Kiryu expectantly refuses, until he learns just who exactly it is he's dealing with.
わしの顔立てたってくださいや。
合流会。
わしは近江連合合流会2代目の合田隆二と申します。で、お名前は？
名乗るほどのものじゃね
え。わしもこうして腹割って話しとるんです。名前ぐらい教えてもろてもええやないですか。
桐生一馬だ。
堂島の竜、登場界の桐生一馬さんですか。
いや、そんな男は知らねえ。
兄さんも人が悪いわ。驚かさんといてください。まあでも本物なわけないわな。本物やったらこんなところで酒飲んでられるわけないわ。
どうしてだ。
本物やったら今頃それどころやない。必死こいて戦争の準備しとるはずや。
ああ、せや。せっかくやから教えますわ。さっきわしが切れたわけ。
なんだ。
わし、関西の竜と呼ばれんのが気に入らんのです。竜はまだ関西が嫌なんです。竜に関西も堂島もありゃしません。極道の世界で竜と呼ばれる男は一匹でええんですわ。あんたもそう思いますやろ。
まあな。
あんたとは気が合いますな。これも何かの縁や。少し喋りすぎました。まあ、桐生さんはごゆるりとくつろいでってください。ああ、そう。一つ言い忘れましたわ。あんたの体からプンプン匂うんですわ。血の香りが。
This sets off a series of events where a reluctant but honor-bound Kiryu sets out to bring about the peace between the clans at all costs, a dangerous, perhaps even impossible task, which naturally leads us to beg the question, why? Why does Kiryu even care what happens to the Tojo clan? After all, it's fueled the infighting that's directly resulted in, well, pretty much every person he cares about being violently murdered. He owes nothing to Terada, him originally even being an Omi man himself. So why then? Well, in my opinion at least, it's because Kiryu feels an overwhelming amount of guilt. Not even just survivor's guilt, indicated by his line of wondering why he's the only one left alive. A guilt and a need to fix the mistakes of his family, both figuratively and literally, to atone for the sins of the father. This theme covers a lot more than just Kazuma's deeds, as we've mentioned before, but we can start with the Dojima family's assassin first, because even from the grave, his past is catching up with him. Worse yet, it's being thrown in the lap of his son without rhyme or reason. Early on in the story, we get a glimpse into a raid taking place in the 80s, several years before the events of Zero, where Kazuma and Shimano are executing a rival Korean mafia by the name of the Jingwon. This is the pivotal event which ties all of Yakuza 2's characters together, and Kazuma is its initiator. To cut a rather needlessly long story short, and assuming you're at least partially familiar with the events of the game, the Jingwon survivors taking revenge on the Tojo is the central conflict of the story. The remnants orchestrating an elaborate plot, roping in the Omi and, ironically enough, innocent bystanders, is at the end of the day all for naught. The people who were responsible for the Jingwon raid are long dead, Sohei being killed by Nishiki, while to the Koreans' probable delight, Shimano and Kazuma taking each other out. And yet, Kiryu is forced to clean up a mess he had no hand in, at least not intentionally. Speaking of father figures, Daigo Dojima, Sohei's son, whom we last saw as a little boy back in Yakuza 0, is returning to the stage in the third of the 3 games, his absence in one being explained by him going to jail for getting framed by the Omi, while Kiryu spent his decade in a different slammer. Disgruntled, nihilistic, and disinterested in having anything to do with the Tojo, Daigo is a kid thrown into a world where the closest thing he had to a father figure that wasn't an adulterous, sleazy piece of trash were Kiryu and Nishiki, only to find out that one of them actually did kill his dad, it hardly mattering when it turns out it was the other one instead. In order to begin rebuilding a clan nearly disintegrated by the ones closest to him, Kiryu needs to bring in Daigo as a leader, knowing that no old-timey gangster or ruthless businessman hiding behind a pin could fill in that role instead. Understandably, the young man really couldn't care less about putting a second Dojima in charge of the Tojo. Even putting aside years of trauma thinking Kiryu murdered Sohei, Kazuma was directly responsible for undermining the Dojima family back in Zero, so there is a fair amount of bad blood between the two father-son duos. And yet still, Kiryu sees something in Daigo that reminds him of himself, a potential that needs guidance, and an opportunity to bring in a new legend without repeating his own father's mistakes. Throughout the game, Daigo grows from a disrespectful punk, as eager as he is hot-blooded, as shown by his compulsion to duke it out with Ryuji, as outmatched as he is, and also by his theme being called Rebellious Phase, into a skilled and capable leader, the tattoo on his back representing Fudo Myo, a Buddhist deity protecting the faith and its wisdom, cutting ignorance with his fiery sword around which a dragon has wrapped itself, signifying how Daigo wields Kiryu as the Tojo's greatest weapon. It is also fitting that while Sohei coveted the title of chairman his entire life, but was outmaneuvered by Kazuma and Sera, never achieving that position no matter how devious and cruel his scheming, Daigo clears his literal surname and actually ascends to the top, not only as the 6th chairman, but as its greatest and most principled one yet. Kaoru Sayama is another important character in Kiwami 2's story, a female cop from Osaka PD assigned to guard Kiryu after his visit to Sotenbori turns heated. A capable police officer, and also, as is later revealed, an orphan like Kiryu, she serves not only as another inheritor of the game's themes, but also as a direct mirror to the protagonist himself. Sayama is known as the Yakuza Huntress, and has always wanted to fight organized crime after learning the Tojo are supposedly responsible for her parents' deaths. She's focused her entire career on that vague piece of evidence that could lead her to their identities. An older, wiser Kiryu asks her if she really thinks she wants to know, directly admitting Kazuma killed his own parents, and that the truth could be worse than being kept in the dark. The ex-Tojo chairman and the Osaka cop investigate the mystery of the Jingwon's involvement in the slowly starting war between the Omi and the Tojo, as they fight together and confide within each other, Kiryu not having any close friends left, having stewed his thoughts and regrets in his head for over a year, and Sayama using the opportunity to consult a real Tojo legend. It isn't really Kiryu's charm that wins her over, as much as his brutal honesty. The man is, in a lot of ways, running on autopilot, letting duty control his body. I mean, sure, he's strong, but he doesn't really have anything left to protect, just right the wrongs of his family and of himself. This is why, when he has to save Haruka, he will go through an entire castle with a stab wound to do it, and why later on, he'll do it for Kaoru too. It is revealed that Sayama's real parents are the surviving wife of the Jingwon boss from the raid, and Kuwara, the cop that saved her. All throughout her life, with the very exception of his final moments, Kuwara risked his life to save the daughter who never knew of his existence, murdering Jingwon assassins at the expense of his record as an officer, like a parallel for Kazuma, both lying fathers who, although with the best of intentions, have gallons of blood on their hands. And speaking of blood, with his last words, Kuwara reaffirms another theme of the game, no, the entire series, that bonds go beyond relation, that our brothers, our sons, and who we become as people are things we ultimately choose ourselves.
人言派のものじゃない。優しくて働き者で強い心を持ったスヨンの血だ。
そして河原さん、お父さんの血もね。
Interwoven with the idea of these children and brothers inheriting their father's sins is that of them inheriting their vengeance. In fact, revenge plays a huge part in the game's story. It permeates almost every action and corrodes like acid. Revisiting the sins of the father, we can also jot down the sins of the brother as well. In 2006, the whole of the Nishikiyama family is mad at Kiryu. Ironically enough, for all the hardships Nishiki endured, he managed to create a family that was loyal to him to a fault. So much so, in fact, that it surpassed his own mortal wishes, and still wants to kill Kiryu for the sake of someone who not only is long dead, but settled his rivalry with him. The problem lies in the fact that ever since Nishikiyama's death, his clan has only grown, incorporating the headless Shimano and Majima families, with their respective leaders now gone. With former Lieutenant Shindo at the helm, a man who claims to respect Akira's wishes, but who in reality boils down a decade of interpersonal struggles to "you and the patriarch fought over a woman last year, so I'm not hypocritical in doing the same." The remaining family stains everything Kiryu's brother left behind. I think it isn't far-fetched to say, Kiryu interprets Shindo's actions as a direct insult to his brother, and yet again, he takes responsibility for this loose end. as he literally saves the Tojo in its darkest hour. Not out of any duty to the clan itself, because quite frankly it was the institution that pushed Nishiki down his path of destruction, but on his behalf, to make sure Nishikiyama's redemption wasn't something only witnessed by him and Yumi. Then we have the Jingwon, a deadly, zealous crime syndicate hell-bent on revenge. As much as it spun like some sort of one-sided Tojo massacre that Kazuma and Shimano enacted on them in 1980, the Jingwon were a savage mafia operating in a foreign land. That enough warrants them little more sympathy than any other Yakuza family, but the step where they go beyond is in their rabid fanaticism. Death before dishonor being their motto. What this means in practice is that any and all members who are caught are expected to quickly commit suicide, and those who refuse to freely give their lives away for the cause are ruthlessly hunted down by their own kin. What little defense of an oath-bound honor there was in characters like Kuze, Awano, and Kazuma, who stuck to their guns although still consciously working for corrupt organizations, is completely and utterly shown to be a horrible creed in the Jingwon. These are people who decades later dedicate their every waking moment not to find out some truth, not to protect someone dear, but to murder the descendants of their initial enemies. And they genuinely believe it too. Kurahashi is so brainwashed, he expects Sayama to join what is essentially a cult she only now learns about, knowing for a fact that the same people hunted down and murdered her own mother, and is actually surprised when she declines. There is nothing noble about the Jingwon. The Jingwon are like zombies, being driven by a poisonous anger that has to be focused somewhere, but with no obvious directions, since its initial reason for existing no longer makes sense. It all puts into perspective just how much duty and honor can be perverted into a meaningless violence that only continues a cycle of hatred. In contrast to other foreign mafia or domestic Yakuza clans in later games, having the blood of a leader flowing through your own veins can mean being granted access to power or even unwanted protection, but in the case of the Jingwon, it only means an inheritance of an unending bloodlust or an early death. I'd like to take a moment to move away from following 2's plot and take a step back. What binds the story of Yakuza Kiwami 2, to me at least, is a sense of finality. Yes, again, I know this was not meant to be a trilogy, but it does fit, well, almost perfectly. A good example of this being Majima's story. With the remake of the old PlayStation 2 game came an added Majima bonus chapter you can play at your behest, even if it's not necessary to complete the main storyline. It's nothing special in terms of gameplay, itself being quite limited in scope and interaction, but it's set right after the events of 1, and half a year or so before 2. In it, we can see something only implied in the original, Terada's Tojo. Profits have become the main priority, seniorship and tenure losing all their meaning, in a move reminiscent of Zero. We see why Majima decided to leave the clan before the main game's events, and his brief reunion with Makoto, tying a nice bow on his arc starting from the first game we see him in. Yes, we as the audience know she found happiness with her husband after the events of Zero, but all this time, the past 18 years, Majima never found that out, and it isn't a stretch to say he still has lingering feelings for her, to say nothing of his one karaoke song in the game. So it's nice the man can finally put that part of his mind to rest, safe in the knowledge she'll permanently be safe on the other side of the world with her new family. We also get an early glimpse into a type of Yakuza we never saw before, but one which will make his way to the main stage soon enough: the ruthless businessman. Awano dug himself into a cash-filled hole in the ground, and Shibusawa ran the books throughout the first game, sure, but both of them had a deeper respect for what it meant to be a made man, even in their own warped way. Ibuchi, on the other hand, a simple throwaway antagonist serving to illustrate a bigger point, however, simply looked at the whole franchise as just that, a business, where reaping the rewards was its own endpoint. And sure as always, such a soulless pragmatist cannot coexist in the same space as people like the Mad Dog. As short and bare bones as it is, Majima's chapter hints at some aspects of 2's story which otherwise come out of left field, and melancholically enough, gives us a last playable glimpse of our fan favorite Cyclops, adding in that little bit of characterization beyond wacky knife guy the original 1 and 2 sorely lack. Returning to the main story, While Kiryu and Sayama form a great duo to explore the themes of Yakuza 2, I've been purposefully avoiding talking about the game's antagonist and third main character, Ryuji Goda. Ryuji encapsulates all of this game and the trilogy so far's themes in a way that doesn't seem anything more than surface level in the first place, but which couldn't be further from the truth. Right from the start, players who've been keen on completing Majima's side stories in Zero might recognize him as the pants-stealing, overgrown middle school student from Sotenbori. While longtime fans of the series can chuckle at this little cameo, I think it's all the more heartbreaking that people who started with Zero see him first as this rebellious but deeply troubled kid, foreshadowing his story 18 years later. Following the events of Yakuza 0, Ryuji is shown to be a big, brutish, but also slightly charismatic villain, blunt and prideful, but not dishonorable. And while this might not initially be interesting, in the context of the last 3 games, Ryuji stands out for a number of reasons. First off, while Shibusawa was an older, more seasoned Yakuza fighting against the newbie, and Nishiki was Kiryu's perfect thematic equal, them literally being brothers, Ryuji is much younger than the Dragon of Dojima. That said, this most definitely does not mean he is weaker. In fact, Ryuji is taller and just plain bigger than Kiryu, even after he put on some more meat in his bones while transitioning over to the Dragon Engine. This is the first time Kiryu doesn't have the upper hand in Battle of Muscles and has to resort to more experience and agility in order to stand a chance. Another difference between Ryuji and all our previous main villains is that this youth translates to impatience. Shibusawa and Nishiki might have hesitated or remained in the shadows for the entire game, but Ryuji? He's ready to sling fists as early as chapter 3 when he attempts a coup d'etat on his own clan, just to prevent peace between the Omi and the Tojo and initiate a war he knows he'll most likely win. A little detail in this fight: while all of Kiryu's opponents in the previous 2 games have fallen to his elbow slam, Ryuji just shrugs it off and continues swinging. After a brutal rumble shockingly early in the game, he is only stopped by the Osaka cops arriving at the scene. On first glance, the brute that is Ryuji is only characterized by one thing: his incessant desire to be the only dragon, be it in Kansai or Kamurocho. But remembering the previous game's entries, and especially Shibusawa's speech from the first game, we automatically associate the tattoo as a status symbol, proof that one is not only the strongest, but has earned that title. And yet, the truth, revealed to us chapter by chapter, with each small scene that oozes character he's featured in, Ryuji is shown to be a lonely, sad, and honestly confused man. During his intrusion at Terada's funeral, Yayoi Dojima tries to compare him to Daigo, a child who needs to build up and even redeem their parents' legacies, but Ryuji shuts that down immediately. Jin Goda isn't Ryuji's real father. He's adopted. Wouldn't really matter if they were blood anyways, since he's been alone from day one. Everyone in the Omi either fears his power or dismisses him as a brash kid way in over his head. Ryuji never had a Nishiki, a Tachibana, a Yumi, or even a Kuze. His whole life, he's been treated as different, not knowing why, with the only thing worth anything in the world of the Yakuza being something we've heard before. It just goes to show you how little this existence has allowed him, when he wouldn't even get his own tattoo and had to steal it from Kazabori. Through his actions, Ryuji displays both forcefulness and respect, shown by his disgust with Sengoku kidnapping a little girl, prompting him to do what Kiryu never could, and straight up kill the sleazy bastard right then and there. Or when he spares Kiryu at Stardust, noting that once again, if he ends him this way, he wouldn't deserve to call himself the only dragon. Which leads us to our other dragon, Kiryu. Knowing the history of the franchise, people can overlook one major hidden theme of the game relating to his state. Although Kiwami 2 is filled with quite interesting side stories and fun activities, this can distract, exactly how it distracts Kiryu, from the underlying theme, the underlying narrative of his deep-seated sadness. I believe the city we the player explore in the 3 games is a very good way of exemplifying this. In Yakuza 0, the streets of Kamurocho are bright, flashy, and because of all the property buying and back and forth, homely, familiar. You literally have an in-game reason to go to every building and try every minigame. In Kiwami, they are dirtier, grimier, kind of dull and empty really, unknown and cold after a 10-year for Kiryu and 17-year hiatus for the player. And finally, in 2, they regain their shine slowly, but Kamurocho isn't really the same place, and neither is Sotenbori. No roaming world boss, no real character to the town, with even the park being replaced by a half-finished concrete slab. It is evident Kiryu doesn't much care for it, even by the simple fact he chooses to leave after the events of 1. Furthermore, a lot of the side and main story revolves around the fact that, for all his power and good intentions, Kiryu is nearly always the reason for the ill fate that befalls those around him. Bantam almost went out of business because of the violent ongoings around it. The Jingwon massacre went off because Kiryu tried to intervene, and perhaps most importantly of all, it was Kiryu who placed Terada as his successor, making a brash and ultimately incredibly bad decision, not only because of Terada's eventual reveal as the Jingwon leader, but also simply because he bypassed more qualified Tojo men like Kashiwagi or Majima. As much as Nishiki and Kazuma did things Kiryu rightly doesn't have to, but ultimately does answer for, he also has his own sins to bear. Throughout these 3 games, we've seen Kazuma as a stalwart defender of virtue, owing a lot to the fact we, the player, are controlling him, and his naive charisma. But lest we forget, he is not innocent. Yes, the deep guilt in Kiryu's heart makes him take the blame for other things that aren't his fault, but he knows he must take accountability, one way or another. Near the end of the game, as he has cleansed his family's name and ensured the Tojo's survival, we get a small section to spend with Haruka, just before the final showdown with Ryuji. Usually this type of mechanic takes place after the end of a given title, with a trust meter that fills up whenever the two of you do an activity together. But I think if not intentional, it fits that it's placed here, in the penultimate chapters of the game. See, picking up on the subtle hints throughout the story, we can see Haruka's not the little girl she used to be. Well, she was remarkably taking in the events of the previous game like a champ, but that only furthers the point. Caring for a trauma-ridden Kiryu, handling the predatory entertainment world by herself, Haruka, while still being a child, has grown up dramatically in the span of a year. Although she still loves Kiryu, she doesn't need him. Same as with the other acquaintances Kiryu has left throughout the city. Date has reinstated his position within the force as a respected detective. Yuya has confronted his past and is taking care of the club, and hell, Majima himself is literally rebuilding Kamurocho. Safe in that knowledge, selfishly, Kiryu steps out into the city streets and sets out towards Kamurocho Hills, a fight that may very well be his last, and one that deep down inside, perhaps he hopes is. But first, the Dragon of Dojima has to deal with an army of Jingwon in his way. With every city block covered by Jingwon soldiers, Kiryu busts through street by street, unrelenting and single-minded, in an epic war of attrition, a true beast. On the skeleton of Kamurocho's newest tower, Sayama and Ryuji wait. The Dragon of Kansai is irritated and puzzled, expecting Kiryu, but instead getting a cop, until a piece of information strikes him like a knife through the gut.
ゴーダリュウジ、あなたは覚えているはずよ。炎で燃えるビルから助け出されたことを。
それが何やっちゅうや。
あなたも知っているでしょ。自分がジンゴン派の生き残りであるということは。
せやからそれが何やねん。
あなたが知らないところで、ジョン・スヨン、つまりあなたの母親は生きていたの。名前を変えてね。 河原祥子。私のお母さんよ。あなたと私はジョン・スヨンの血を分け合った兄弟なのよ。
どういうことへ？
私はあなたを助けたい、たった一人の兄弟として、そして一人の刑事として。だからもうこれ以上戦うのはやめて。郷田隆二さん、あなたを逮捕します。
嘘へ。わしに妹がおるなんて。
Goda the Elder confirms. All his life, Ryuji's been deprived of both real family and friends. All of his actions have been shaped by this gaping hole in his heart. And yet, here he is, at the end of the line, discovering he has a sister. And Jin, much like Kazuma and Kuwara, has his own actions to answer for. Although helping Suyeon escape by sheltering her baby, he insisted on her leaving him because he desperately wanted a son himself, forever sealing Ryuji's fate away from his mother and sister. Shaken as he is though, and silently contemplating if coming to this very moment in time was worth it, Ryuji, much like someone else, has come too far to go back.
俺の親友だった男によく似てる。戦うことこそが生きていることの証。そういう男には俺も全身全霊をかけて応えるぜ。カオル、すまない。よっしゃ、なら一丁派手に極道の花探せようやないか。
ここまでは見事に私の筋書き通りに動いてくれました。
まさかその声は寺だ。
As the would-be dead man reveals his cards and a bomb with which to take blind vengeance upon the city, Kiryu rises to the occasion, even while battered and bruised. Although prolonged and anticlimactic, these last confrontations put the bow on the idea of just how pointless the Jingwan's quest is. Ryuji fought because he was lied to his whole life and had no other choice. Terada fights although he has succeeded in his vengeance and can turn away, and just like Ibuchi foreshadowed almost a year before, Takasugi simply fights to expand his riches. With Sayama as a hostage, he taunts what he calls idiotic idealists, while Kiryu still can't bring himself to murder. Before his eyes flashes the last time he let this cost the life of a loved one, but luckily for him, another dragon rises to the occasion.
Ryuji!
お前みたいなバカに裏をかかれるとは。
男はのバカなくらいでちょうどええんや。我のような計算高い男は所詮天下など取れんのや。
What is a dragon? What does it mean? Shibusawa wanted the name's proof, an inked piece of evidence that he was not only strong, but respected. He was old, clearly toiling away under Dojima for years, if not decades, to finally get that little piece of recognition, to be something other than a pencil pusher. Nishiki's koi is meant to one day swim up the Yellow River, pass the gate and transform into a dragon itself, for him to finally be equal to his brother, who already had one on his back from day one. And Ryuji, similar to Shibusawa, he already had a brilliant dragon roaring behind him, but that tattoo wasn't given to him. That fate wasn't assigned to him, and the only way for his golden beast to truly come into its own is to eliminate all the other ones. And what about Kiryu? Is being the strongest thing out there worth all the inevitable pain and suffering? In his mind, no. When at the end of Zero he says there can only be one dragon, it's thrilling and blood pumping. But repeating it in 2, he's finally understood its somber meaning, the tragic inevitability of that phrase. Being one is suffering. It's not wisdom or strength, it's an ambition that burns everything around oneself. Shot at the exact opposite sides, and with the bomb quickly ticking along, Ryuji and Kiryu know their deaths are close. Taking the opportunity, they silently agree to finally do it, to put an end to all dragons.
そして生きろ。俺にはまだやることがある。
こんな男初めて。さすがわしの妹が惚れた男や。こいつの言う通りや。はよ逃げ。
何言ってるのよ。私はもうこれ以上家族が死ぬのは嫌だ。好きな人が死ぬのも嫌なんや。
分かってる。
だったら今すぐ。
うっさいわボケ。なあ、わしらもうボロボロや。どうせ助からん。時間がないんや。
でも
一生に一度や。兄ちゃんの頼み聞いてくれへんか。さあ、お互いあんま時間はないな。ええか、行くで。
ああ、手加減はしねえ。来い。
10年前、ゴーダリュウジを初めて見た時、わしは衝撃を覚えた。この男はわしの生涯最高の下地になる男やと。
風間がお前くらいの年の頃、あいつがどんな極道だったか知っているか。腕といい度胸といい、俺から見ても惚れ惚れするような男気を持つ本物の男だった。お前が本当に10億の価値があるのか。
親父、よう見とけ。わしはあんたを超える。
長いこと暗い道を歩いていると、この先もずっと暗いもんだと思っちまう。前に進むことが嫌になる。自分の道がこの先どうなってるか分かってるやつなんだ。この世に一人もいる。俺らにできるのは立ち止まって泣くか、一歩でも前に進むかの二つだけだ。逃げちゃダメってことだな。逃げずに頑張って、そして残った道が そいつのやるべきことっていうか。
今更だが、お前とはもう一度一緒にやりたかった。
もっと来いよ。なんだそのパンチは。
桐生、
行こうぜ。意識。
As Kaoru climbs back right after, Ryuji's on death's door. He has one final goodbye with his only true family, going out with a smile on his face, much like Yumi to Kiryu in the last game. Following suit, Kazuma collapses as well. He too knows this is the end, and accepts it without remorse. Another great detail adding to the sense of finality this fight has, is that no matter how much health you have, if you miss the final QTE, you will die. With no other fight in the series doing this except for 5, where Kiryu 2 is heavily implied to have met his end. This time though, his beloved isn't leaving him in another world, and chooses to wait out the timer right there with him. And as the ticks ring out across the city, Kamurocho's finest closes his eyes, confident in all those who will carry out his legacy, to protect and treasure what he did in life after his passing. I know plenty of people who disagree with the statement of this video, and may say I'm reading too much into things that aren't there, while simultaneously ignoring large elements of the game's plot. And yeah, I'm willing to concede on that, but not without my reasons. For example, Yumi's role in the first game kind of comes out of nowhere and really isn't as strong as that of Kiryu and Nishiki's brotherhood, so I didn't really place much emphasis on it. Similarly, I chose to omit Kiryu being responsible for the Jingwon massacre as a little kid. 1, because it creates gigantic plot holes in the story, and 2, because it really doesn't fit the themes of the game. Suddenly Terada's a good guy because he grew conscience in the last second, but actually he removed the fuse from the bomb long before he did that? I think you can clearly see how interpreting 2 as Kiryu's death, whether willing or not, makes more sense. If we're going to be discussing a Yakuza trilogy, I also feel the need to mention how 3 was probably intended as a bookend, but why I much prefer the grouping of 0, K1, and K2 rather than the more official one of OG 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to be spoiling Yakuza 3 here, so if you don't want to know what happens there, skip to this section of the video. My belief that 3 was meant to be the last one of the trilogy stems from a few things. It being the last game the Nishikiyama family appears in, having a remix of their signature theme, while also being the last entry for Arase in Lao Kalong, and to top it all off, having a fake-out return of Kazuma. Similarly, while Nishiki's tattoo in 1 was a proto-dragon, and Ryuji was a full one, Mine, Yakuza 3's final boss's tattoo, was a Kirin, a creature from Chinese mythology which is the only one able to kill a dragon. All that said, it simply does not work on a thematic level. Sayama, for one, unceremoniously gets written out of the story, cutting off any exploration of Kiryu's potential love interest for the rest of the series. And if Shindo was a surface-level misunderstanding of Akira's struggles and love for Yumi, then the aforementioned Nishikiyama family and its boss Kanda is a flat-out joke, and not a very funny one at that. It honestly feels like spitting on Nishiki's legacy to an unnecessary degree. To top it all off, if you choose to do so, interpreting Kiryu's death at the end of 3 is much less satisfying, considering it's not an opportunity to rid the world of harmful expectations and myths, but is his philosophy blowing up in his face, since Hamazaki would only prove to have understood Kiryu's ideas in 4. Also, why would Kiryu want to die now that he has his own orphanage to run? Him dying at the end of 2 is bittersweet, because he's lost every person in his family. And although Sayama returning his affection hints at his ability to start a new one, it's too late. Compare that with a father of 9 bleeding out in the middle of the street, which is downright tragic. Plus, if you're going to interpret 3's post-credits scene as Kiryu imagining he's in heaven, the whole of that game works much better for an analogy rather than a simple scene. Overall, while I do love a bunch of elements from 3, Mina included, and I disagree with people who call it a bad game, it's definitely my least favorite of the series and would be a limp finish if it closed off Kiryu's story. This video has taken me just about a year to finish. Even though it's been a big project that took quite a lot of my time, I'd do it all over again just to share my love and appreciation for the series. In fact, replaying not just these 3, but other entries in the franchise has shown me just how much depth there is in even the more simple of the game's stories. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Tehsnakerer for inspiring these videos. He's a fantastic guy and YouTuber, and the madman is so dedicated he did a 7-hour retrospective on Yakuza 5. If you like this sort of content, I highly recommend going over to his channel. Tell him I said hi. I'd also like to thank the Yakuza Majima posting community, especially our Discord. I don't know if I've ever had the patience to write and edit all of this if I didn't have so many wonderful lads to obsess over these games with. Of course, my great patrons Hunter and Rodion, and finally, I'd like to thank you, yes you, for sticking with me and watching all these ramblings. Minna-san, arigato.